Let's talk about postal voting and why it's such a big deal in the US presidential election. A lot of voters want to mail in their ballots because of the pandemic, to stay safe.
For the first time, more than 3/4 of Americans will be allowed to vote by mail.
But President Donald Trump doesn't like it.
Mail ballots are a very dangerous thing for this country because they're cheaters.
He's being accused of trying to mess with the election.
This is what democracy looks like!
To politicize and sabotage the Postal Service in order to suppress votes is dangerous.
So how does postal voting work? Can it really lead to voter fraud? And how might all of this affect the presidential election? It's pretty astonishing, really, that voting by mail, a pretty standard procedure around the world, is now one of the most talked about issues in this presidential race. We'll get into all the politics in a second, but first, here are some basics. Mail-in balloting in the US is pretty popular. It's for voters who can't get to a polling station on election day. It's for the elderly, the sick, people who live abroad, military personnel, and people who just prefer to vote that way. President Trump mailed in his ballot in 2018. So did 1/4 of all voters in the last election. Different states have different rules. There's what's called universal mail voting, where ballots are automatically sent to everyone. And this year, 5 states will run mail-in only elections, including Utah, a solidly Republican state. But in most states, Americans have to apply to get what's called an absentee ballot. They have to contact their local election authority, and normally they have to make the case why they can't vote in person. But this year, because of the pandemic, 2/3 of US states say they don't require registered voters to give an excuse in order to get an absentee ballot, meaning a lot more people will be able to vote by mail this time around. So understandably, there's concern that there's going to be a strain on the United States Postal Service that could lead to delays and mistakes, because they do happen. In 2016, states rejected about 1% of ballots for things like late arrivals and missing signatures.
With a lot more people voting by mail this year, I think it stands to reason there are going to be more of these problem ballots.
But there are safeguards to try to reduce errors and stop fraud. For example, an absentee ballot can only be sent to a person's registered address. One envelope keeps the ballot private, and a second envelope is used to mail it back, though most Americans choose to drop off the envelopes at government offices. Voters also have to sign the ballot envelope, and election officials verify the signature. They also come with barcodes, so they can be traced. All of those checks take extra time and money. But this year, the US Postal Service is spending less, not more.
Mailbox removed, high-speed sorting machines ripped out, overtime stopped for many.
There have been huge cuts. In some states, it's already led to delays.
It's nothing been in there for the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks! No bills, no paper, no nothing.
The man behind those cuts is the new Postmaster General, who took charge in June. Louis DeJoy is a businessman who was appointed by Trump to reform the Postal Service. And it is in trouble. It's $160 billion in debt. That's mostly because back in 2006, a new law forced the post office to prepay employees' retirement and healthcare benefits 75 years into the future. Add to that, things like people not mailing as much as they used to. But Trump's critics are still skeptical of DeJoy's appointment for a few reasons. He's personally given the Republican Party and Donald Trump close to $3 million in donations since 2016.
That's concerning to us, not only his financial relationships with the White House, but with private businesses that are in competition with the United States Postal Service. And the whole idea is it's not supposed to be a politicized agency.
He currently holds stock in a company that has business dealings with the U.S. Postal Service. It does raise questions about ethical conflicts.
President Trump has appointed a lot of people sort of loyal to him. What's unusual about the Postal Service is that historically the Postal Service has always promoted people from within.
Another concern is about timing. Why bring these cuts in now?
Instituting these sort of cost-cutting exercises in the middle of an election year, literally months before the election, looks very suspicious.
So why are people suspicious? Well, for the last year, President Trump has been attacking mail-in balloting. And he's making a lot of accusations that ballots will be forged and even illegally printed out and fraudulently signed, that mail drop boxes make it possible for people to vote multiple times, and that they aren't COVID sanitized. That last one was actually flagged up by Twitter as potentially misleading.
Mail-in ballots for voting.
I think mail-in voting is horrible.
But you voted by
It's
mail
corrupt.
in Florida's election last month, didn't you?
Sure, I could vote by mail for that.
How do you reconcile
Because I'm
that?
allowed to.
He's also openly said that universal mail-in voting, in his words, doesn't work out well for Republicans.
The Democrats are doing it because, in theory, it's good for them.
There's sort of an instinctive belief among many that making it easier to vote in any way will likely help Democrats. The demographic groups that have the lowest turnout rates in the United States, younger people, low-income people, racial and ethnic minorities, those are groups that tend to vote for Democrats.
At the same time, postal voting is also used a lot by elderly voters. Studies show they tend to skew Republican. And Trump is actually encouraging mail-in voting in Florida, which is home to a lot of retirees. But it's a different story in Nevada. Trump is suing the state for changing its rules so that all registered voters get a ballot in the mail. Here's the thing. Florida has a Republican governor. Nevada's is a Democrat. It's why Trump's opponents feel this is all deeply political. Okay, so what about these allegations of possible corruption? Well, fraud is rare, but it does happen. The Washington Post did an analysis of recent elections in 3 vote-by-mail states. They found 372 possible cases of double voting or voting on behalf of people who died. That was out of more than 14 million mail-in ballots. That's a minuscule percentage. The most recent example of fraud was in 2018, involving a staff member of North Carolina's Republican Congressman Mark Harris.
Harris's political strategist, McCrae Dallas, accused of tampering with more than 500 absentee ballots to help Harris win.
So while the politicians argue about the odds of a rigged election, plenty of people are worried that this will all just end up a giant mess. And that's mainly because of those budget cuts to the Postal Service. DeJoy says he's paused them. But some think the damage has already been done. He was even called in by a congressional committee to reassure Americans that the postal system can handle all those votes.
The Postal Service is fully capable and committed to delivering the nation's election mail securely and on time.
Many Democrats, though, aren't convinced. The House of Representatives, which is controlled by the Democrats, passed an emergency bill to give $25 billion to the post office. More than 24 Republicans voted for it.
The bill is passed.
But the Republican-controlled Senate hasn't passed the bill.
Anybody who wants to give money to the post office, you might as well just put it into a big pile on your front lawn and burn it. You can't run a business with 80% of your costs being labor.
But politics aside, actually most Americans, Democrats and Republicans, hold up the Postal Service as an important public institution. And right now, it's under a lot of pressure. It's got to help deliver this election in the middle of a pandemic. And delays are likely. Some states will still be counting votes that arrive after Election Day. So let's be clear. We probably can't expect to have a winner straight away. And any hiccups could be used by both presidential candidates to contest the result. And they say they're ready for a fight.
The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election.
He knows that on the legit, it'd be hard for him to win. So he wants to put obstacles of participation. But we do not agonize, we organize.
This year, more than ever, Americans are relying on the U.S. Postal Service to help choose their next president. But this whole drama has created doubt in a system many have trusted. They need it to work, because this election, it's expected to be a close one. That was just one of a series of explainers we've been working on to help us all understand the issues around the US election. So to keep up with all our upcoming episodes, I recommend subscribing to Al Jazeera wherever you're watching this video. I'll see you next week.